Thank you, Maureen. It's a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate the invitation from my colleagues to be here once again in Lausanne, which is such a beautiful part of Switzerland, especially in the fall. So today I'm going to be talking about the prenatal period, but you are going to see me making connections to the preconceptual period as well. And I've decided to focus a little bit more on what do we know about what's the best kind of information to give pregnant women during pregnancy, and what is the evidence for that, and then to focus a little bit on some of the intervention studies. So while this slide says the U.S. infant mortality in general, we know that 2/3 of infants die within the first 28 days. And when we look at that statistics, it's very interesting to find that there are 5 leading causes of death, and those are listed here. But the ones in blue, birth defects, disorders related to shortened gestation and low birth weight, and maternal pre-pregnancy complications, those 3, which account for 38% of all the infant deaths, are actually associated with modifiable lifestyle factors. And as you just heard in the previous talk, we can contribute folic acid to a lot of the different birth defects. So I'm going to be talking about maternal diet as one of the modifiable lifestyle factors that we can actually help to change, as well as maternal weight status and weight gain during pregnancy. So I'm going to focus on the maternal diet, and I am going to talk about the prenatal period, because you've heard a little bit about the preconception period. And I'm going to be focusing on foods, not supplements, okay? And we're going to focus on what we know in the literature about the timing and what types of foods are actually being consumed. And the reason why is because, as you'll see when I present some more information, there's been lots of different nutrients that have received attention during pregnancy. And I could add vitamin D to this list here, which I mistakenly left out. But nutrients don't exist in isolation. And most individuals are eating foods that have lots of different nutrients that tend to be correlated in the foods that they're eating. And so, in fact, these nutrients with the foods and non-nutrients that exist in those foods create what we like to call a dietary pattern. And the dietary patterns work that we are adopting in the nutrition epidemiology field is basically looking at the quantities and the types of foods that people consume, because we believe that the nutrients as well as the other food components have a synergistic effect on how they're acting in our bodies to either make us healthy or make us more susceptible to different types of diseases. And so, in fact, you're going to hear me talk about these dietary patterns. And when you look across the globe, you can actually sort of, based on some staple foods, you can begin to distinguish people into different types of dietary patterns just based also on where they live. Now, in the nutrition epidemiology field, we have different methodologies to be able to classify people into these dietary patterns. One is by just selective diets, asking people whether or not they follow a vegetarian diet. Another way is using indices and scores, and these are different kinds of indices that have been developed based on national guidance, like the dietary guidelines, or in fact, the Mediterranean diet score is another way of creating these indices and scores that then allow you to create an overall score for the population. And then we have some statistical approaches that we use that are either cluster or factor analysis or a combination of the two that are being used now called latent class analysis. And what we're interested in doing is looking at how these dietary patterns are then related to health outcomes. And I've had the pleasure over the last year to be working with the B to 24 project in the United States, which is getting ready for the next 2020 dietary guidelines work. And so my group was specifically interested in looking at what is the relationship between dietary patterns before and during pregnancy on different birth outcomes. And I'm going to share with you the results of our work from the last year. We predominantly looked at 4 different outcomes of interest. We looked at gestational diabetes, hypertensive disorders, preterm birth, and birth weight. We used the NEL process in order to conduct our systematic reviews. For those of you who are not as familiar, it's, we identify the topic of interest. In this case, it's dietary patterns. We selected our outcomes that we were most interested in. We did the literature search. We didn't do the literature search, so we actually had some staff members who were able to do the literature searches for us. Once we had clearly defined search terms for the literature, these data were extracted from the papers, and we assessed the risk of bias. And then the different expert group, which were about 6 of us, literally assessed the synthesis of the evidence and discussed it quite healthily in terms of whether we believe there was an association or not. And then we graded the information. These results that I'm going to show you now will be actually published in the Nutrition Evidence Library here at this website in the very near future, and the articles are going to be published in a supplement that's forthcoming. So let's start with the first one. The first one was looking at gestational diabetes as an outcome of interest. So here we found 11 different studies that met the inclusion criteria, and there were 6 unique cohort studies. And sample sizes ranged from 12, the 12 was a really small randomized study, to the average, the largest sample size we had, which was 15,000. And so we were basically looking at how were dietary patterns associated with gestation, the development of gestational diabetes. We found that 5 studies that examined dietary patterns anywhere from 2 to 10 years before pregnancy found an association with the development of gestational diabetes during pregnancy. For dietary patterns during pregnancy and the risk of GDM, the findings were more mixed. So we had 3 that showed an association with gestational diabetes, and 1 that only showed an association with the continuous blood glucose measure that's done as a universal screening test. But it did not find an association with predicting gestational diabetes. What was interesting, though, was when we look across these studies, and I'm going to show this in the 4 different reviews that we did, was that those patterns that were found to be protective against developing gestational diabetes included higher vegetable, higher fruit intake, more whole grains, nuts and legumes, and fish, and a lower amounts of red and processed meats. And so I think it's important for us to start picking up the foods that are keep coming up as those that tend to be protective. For hypertensive disorders, there were only 8 studies that met the inclusion criteria. Once again, there was 1 randomized trial in this particular group. Sample size was slightly larger, from 290 to 72,000 women. There were 3 studies that actually came from the mother and baby cohort study from Norway. And we found, and here when we're looking at hypertensive disorders, that included hypertension during pregnancy, preeclampsia, and eclampsia. And we found that 5 of the 8 studies found a significant association between dietary patterns and hypertensive disorders during pregnancy, with greater adherence to a Nordic diet, and we'll show what foods are in there, was associated with reduced risk of early preeclampsia and preeclampsia. And then a lower adherence to the Mediterranean diet, so therefore this was in the negative sense, was associated with a greater odds of having all 3 of those outcomes: hypertension, preeclampsia, and eclampsia. A higher adherence to a healthy or sustainable vegetable or Mediterranean diet was associated with a lower risk of hypertension disorders during pregnancy. And a greater adherence to diets rich in meats and refined grains was found to be detrimental. So basically, we're seeing some similar foods that we found in the gestational diabetes review of the literature. That foods that were higher, dietary patterns higher in vegetables and fruits, whole grains, nuts and legumes, and fish and vegetable oils tended to be more protective, and they were also diets that were lower in meat and refined grains. Now, the next deals with gestational age. And so here we found studies that, there were a total of 11 different studies that looked both at gestational age on a continuous pattern, but also looking at gestational age using a cut point of less than 37 completed weeks to define preterm birth. And then there were some studies that actually separated out medically induced preterm birth and then spontaneously delivered, spontaneous preterm births. And so here, we found that dietary patterns during pregnancy were significantly associated with preterm birth in 5 out of the 8 studies. And a 6th study actually found it greater and stronger associated when preterm birth was defined as early preterm birth, which is less than 33 weeks, completed weeks of gestation. There also was some studies that looked at dietary patterns and spontaneous, and 4 out of the 5 found an association between dietary patterns and spontaneous preterm birth. And when we look at the types of dietary patterns that were associated, we found it was the DASH diet, the Mediterranean diet, a high protein, high fruit pattern diet, vegetable, fruit, rice pattern, and a prudent diet, as well as traditional patterns. So you can see once again this evolution of the similar types of foods that are coming up to being protective against some of these birth outcomes, with preterm birth probably having the strongest evidence to date for during pregnancy. When we looked at birth weight, and there were many more studies at using birth weight as the outcome, there were 21 studies. Sample sizes here ranged from 12 for that small pilot study that was done by CLAP in the early 1990s, and then the largest going out to 66,000 pregnant women. We found that a lot of these studies had some methodological flaws in that they were using birth weight in its rawest form, did not adjust for gestational age, or they used low birth weight as a cut point of less than 2,500 grams, or large heavy birth weight as being greater than 4,500 grams. And so once again, they weren't adjusting for gestational age. And so they were kind of all over the map and kind of hard to compare. But what we basically found was overall that the relationship between dietary patterns and during pregnancy and birth weight outcomes were inconsistent. And the direction of the effect was all over the place. And the one thing that we found pretty astonishing was that very few studies even considered the pre-gravid weight of the mom coming in to pregnancy as being an effect modifier of this relationship between what women were consuming and the birth weight of their child. And so because of that, you would hypothesize that there'd be different effects. If you had an underweight mother who was consuming a better quality diet, you would anticipate a higher birth weight. But if you actually had an overweight or an obese mom who was consuming a better diet, you would hopefully anticipate to have a lower birth weight. And that's the reason why sort of adjusting for that maternal pre-gravid weight is so critical. So in fact, we couldn't really draw any conclusions here related to the literature for birth weight. So there's lots more work that needs to be done in this particular group. Now, I wanted to share with you two studies that were not included because I think they provide some additional evidence to looking at the importance of diet during pregnancy. This was, two of them are both work that I've been involved with. So this is one that we did at UNC, where we looked at pregnant women coming in early on in pregnancy, and for this work we actually had some biomarkers drawn in the fasting state at around 24 to 20 weeks of pregnancy. And so we have information collected on diet using a food frequency questionnaire here. And so we looked at the dietary intakes of women in the second trimester of pregnancy, and then looked at their cardiometabolic markers around 24 to 29 weeks. And we basically decided to use a DASH indice as a score to be able to assess diet quality during pregnancy. And so you can see here the components of the DASH diet, in the fact that there's about 4 or 5 components that are scored in a sort of progressive state. The more you consume, the better the diet quality. And then there's 3 different components that are inversely scored so that they're actually more detrimental if you have higher intakes. And the scores will range anywhere from 8 to 40. And so what we found was that adherence to the healthier dietary pattern, which meant that they had a higher DASH diet score, was related to lower maternal glucose, insulin, the HOMA-insulin ratio, and triglyceride levels. There was no association found between the DASH diet and total cholesterols. And pre-pregnancy BMI slightly attenuated these associations, okay? Another study that I've had the pleasure of working with is with Donna DeBella out of Colorado. And she has a Healthy Start pregnancy cohort where we've recruited 1,400 pregnant women early on in pregnancy. Here we're actually doing 24-hour dietary recalls on these women. They do about 1 a month. And so there's anywhere from 2 to 6 dietary recalls that we average together in order to assess their diet. And you can see they were pretty much a very healthy group of women for which we studied. We used some reduced rank regression. We have biomarkers collected middle of pregnancy in the fasting state. And so we were able to develop these 2 different dietary patterns using this reduced rank regression, where pattern 1 was characterized by women consuming poultry, nuts, seeds, whole grains, cheese, citrus fruits, melons, and berries, other fruits, as well as some added sugar and discretionary fat. And that pattern was correlated with maternal gestational weight gain only. It wasn't correlated with any of the other cardiometabolic markers that we had. Whereas pattern 2, which was characterized by a higher consumption of eggs, potatoes, other starchy vegetables, as well as non-whole grains, that was correlated with both gestational weight gain as well as mid-pregnancy fasting glucose. Now, what's interesting about this study is they actually measured neonatal adiposity because they put the babies in pea pods. And what they found was that pattern 1, remember, which was related to maternal weight gain, was associated with neonatal free fat mass, and it was not associated with fat mass or percent fat mass. So it was related to muscle. Whereas pattern 2, which, if you remember correctly, had some of the starchier vegetables and the non-whole grains, and was also related to glucose and maternal weight gain, that was associated with higher neonatal fat mass and percent body fat. So it's beginning to demonstrate the fact that the quality of the diet has an effect on neonatal adiposity, okay, which is something that we should be paying attention to, because if you just look at birth weight can represent a lot, okay? It's a very generic sort of outcome to measure. But we know that there are limitations in dietary patterns. There's correlated measurement error in assessing these foods that might distort the dietary pattern. Dietary patterns, because it is measuring the synergistic effect of how these foods and nutrients are acting together, we can't pinpoint one nutrient. We're not trying to, okay? And so it doesn't really tell us a lot about the biological mechanisms. So in the absence of strong evidence, if you remember, the strongest evidence was for preterm birth. But there were a lot of characteristics that were shared across those studies, pinpointing foods that tended to be associated with improved pregnancy outcomes. And that's what these foods are listed as here, okay? You saw fish and seafood, you saw higher intakes of vegetables and fruits, whole grains, nuts, seeds, legumes, and vegetable oils. So in the absence of any other types of clear-cut recommendations, what should we do during prenatal care in terms of how to advise women what to eat? Well, in the United States, and quite frankly, globally, in lots of countries nowadays, have developed their own dietary guidelines. In the United States, it's called the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. And both Mary and I were involved in these particular dietary guidelines establishments. And one of the things that we decided that we were doing and that got developed in the policy was that it was very important to try to get people to move away from nutrients to follow dietary patterns work, which sort of goes along with what I was saying before, what we found in the NEL work that we did, and to really focus on meeting nutrient needs through caloric limits, choosing a variety of foods. So exactly what you would want to tell pregnant women are consistent with the dietary guidelines, and quite frankly are consistent with WHO guidelines as well as guidelines that exist in Sweden and many other countries that sort of have developed these dietary patterns, as well as trying to limit calories from added sugars and saturated fats and not have high sodium intakes, and to really focus on nutrition education to sort of shift to healthier food and beverage choices. I think this is the key here, is to helping people choose what foods to eat. And this is a choice that happens multiple times in the day. It's not just a choice you're doing once, but it's every time you go and you're faced with, what am I going to eat today for breakfast? What am I going to eat today for lunch? And the fact that women, pregnant women, need to have this guidance ahead of time so they can understand how to plan for their day. And then in fact, if we don't have a supportive environment, then it's really hard for them to act upon selecting those healthy food choices. And the dietary guidelines, which is supporting sort of the evidence that we just saw, speaks to those same kind of food groups that need to be consumed more often, okay? More vegetables, more fruits, especially whole fruits, grains, whole grains, and then some lower fat dairy products, and a variety of protein foods that include the seafood, lean meats, poultry, eggs. So in the absence of any kind of specific sort of dietary patterns during pregnancy, these types of guidelines are actually very good to be offering pregnant women. Well, pregnant women come in at all different weight status. And one of the things that the prior studies basically showed us is how you come into pregnancy, whether you're underweight, whether you're normal weight, whether you're obese, is really going to influence pregnancy outcomes. And we know that maternal obesity is not something limited just to the United States, but it's actually now global. And we have many parts of the world where we both have under and overnutrition, as was pointed out with earlier by Anne. And so we need to consider the effects of maternal obesity during pregnancy. And so these are the conditions associated with obesity during pregnancy. We know that obese women are more likely to have birth defects, they're more likely to have gestational hypertension, fetal macrosomia, gestational diabetes, preeclampsia, and these other diseases listed here. So it's important that when we start talking about nutrition education for pregnant women, that at the get-go, if they haven't received preconceptional counseling, it's important to let them know that their starting weight into pregnancy is either going to be associated with certain adverse pregnancy outcomes, and they need to be prepared for that. And how can they potentially mitigate those risks that are going to be associated with their entering pre-pregnancy weight, okay? And so it's very important for the healthcare provider to actually initiate that weight conversation. And unfortunately, and I don't know if we're going to touch upon it later on, is the fact that the nutritional care provider is not necessarily equipped, either their physician or other people in the clinic, to actually talk about weight status, how to comfortably approach women about their weight status and what they can do in order to help them have the healthiest pregnancy outcome. What do we know about pregnancy weight status is the fact that we know overweight and obese women are more likely to have C-sections, which means as a prenatal care provider, you need to let them know about that risk and to get them prepared that while they might want to have a vaginal delivery, in the end, they may very well have a C-section. There's strong evidence to show that overweight and obese women have higher birth weights, higher infants of birth weights, and less likely to have low birth weight or SGA infants. We also know that there's moderate evidence that obese women are less likely to initiate breastfeeding, and if they do, they're going to breastfeed for a shorter period of duration. A wonderful opportunity at the beginning of prenatal care to start talking to these women about the importance of breastfeeding and why breastfeeding, in order to break the cycle of risk of obesity, that they should actually be breastfeeding as long as they possibly can to their child. And then there's inconclusive evidence that overweight and obese women retain more weight postpartum. What we do know is that higher gestational weight gain during pregnancy means that you have more weight to take off in the postpartum period. And women lead very hectic lives, and so therefore it's harder to get that weight off. And so it's better for women to be able to gain weight the way they're supposed to during pregnancy with appropriate care. So that leads me to gestational weight gain and why gestational weight gain is so important. And for women to really hear about how much weight they should be gaining during pregnancy. So gestational weight gain has been, the evidence is kind of mixed as to whether or not it's related to preeclampsia and gestational diabetes. And a lot of that is because the literature here is flawed in the fact that we don't have a good sort of cut point on when exactly preeclampsia or gestational diabetes occurs. Preeclampsia and hypertension are usually diagnosed when those clinical symptoms appear, but they actually could have manifested much earlier. The same way for gestational diabetes, even though we're screening women much earlier now if they're obese, we do routine universal screening at around 24 to 29 weeks, but in fact, women might actually have gestational diabetes much earlier and therefore already be predisposing that fetus to high levels of glucose. There is associations with cesarean delivery and preterm birth, both inadequate gestational weight gain as well as excessive, as well as birth weight. And the fact that gestational weight gain, there's evidence of discontinuing of breastfeeding if there's higher weight gain. And clearly, like I said, the more weight you gain during pregnancy, the more likely you're going to retain that weight. So the IOM, which is the Institute of Medicine from the National Academies of Medicine, in 2009 came out with these weight gain recommendations posted here. And one of the things that was really good about these particular weight gain recommendations that came out was that for the first time, obese women had an upper range of gaining at least 20 pounds during pregnancy. Now, I have to say that this was a controversial recommendation. A lot of obstetricians wanted us to recommend obese women not to gain any weight during pregnancy. They felt that the baby could be a complete parasite and get all the nutrients from the mom. And basically, if you look at the different products of conception and how the products of conception are evolving over the course of pregnancy, you see that the only wiggle room is in the amount of maternal fat stores that the mother lays down. And it's in those maternal fat stores that if you actually were to minimize them for obese women, that in fact you could eliminate that, but the rest has to be increasing over the course of pregnancy. And so that's the reason why we came up with the recommendations for obese women. Now, the other thing that's important to know is that when these recommendations were made, most of the data came from women with a BMI from 30 to 35. Nowadays, there are a much greater number of women who have a BMI greater than 35, and so therefore we need to know more about how those women are gaining weight and what's the optimal amount of weight gain they should be having in order to have positive pregnancy outcomes, not only for the baby but also for themselves. So what do we know about some intervention studies during pregnancy? So this is a systematic review that came out in 2015 that I thought did a very, very nice job. And let me walk you through it a little bit. So these are studies that were done looking at diet or exercise or both for preventing excessive weight gain during pregnancy. And what they did was they sort of stratified it by one, looking at the low-risk population. I don't think oh yes we do, right here. The low-risk population over here. And you can see these are the numbers in the intervention group, the overall subtotal, and then we can basically see by looking at the line over here that everything to the left of the line means that it was had a positive association with reducing excessive weight gain. If it's on to the right of the line, that means it really didn't work the way it should have worked. So we have low-risk population. We have some mixed risk population, and then we have high-risk women that are most of these women are overweight or obese women. And so overall, what these studies basically showed was the fact that you can change maternal weight gain during pregnancy, which is positive. You would want to be able to see the fact that you can change maternal weight gain during pregnancy. The studies that were associated with maternal changing weight gain during pregnancy, and this is excessive weight gain, was the fact that they were all frequent contact, high intensity contact, and they had to be started early on in pregnancy. Okay, so those are key factors to consider when you're thinking about delivering interventions during pregnancy. Early on, high intensity, and frequent. This is the same systematic review, the same type of studies, and the same layout, and it basically shows you the amount of weight change. And so while the amount of weight change is small overall, the fact that it could reduce excessive gestational weight gain is very, very important. And so that's one of the things that's positive about this systematic review. The other thing the systematic review did, and I'm only going to show you one set of the slides, is the fact that it doesn't change birth weight very much, okay? So this is basically looking at how much of each of the studies had on overall birth weight. And you can see it only changes it by about 12 grams. Well, that's not we shouldn't really be expecting much of a change. And in fact, if you dig in deeper to this systematic review, it also shows that the intervention studies that were conducted during pregnancy had no effect on changing the risk of gestational diabetes or hypertension. So once again, studies done starting in pregnancy are not able to mitigate the risk factors that occur, those complications that occur during pregnancy, or change birth weight, but they can change maternal weight gain. And maternal weight gain is somewhat telling us a little bit about what's happening in utero for that baby. And so we shouldn't throw out the baby with the bathwater and say, well, you shouldn't intervene at all during pregnancy. We should, because some of that fetal programming that's going on during pregnancy, we know we're actually helping by not having that woman gain so excessively during pregnancy. There's also going to be published, coming out, I was one of the reviewers in the Lancet Adolescent, the Lancet issue of Child and Adolescent Health. They have a combination of about 20 pregnancy cohort studies that involves over 160,000 pregnant women. And they have basically shown that if you just change the incidence of gestational diabetes or hypertension during pregnancy, that you do not actually influence the risk of increased childhood obesity. That the biggest factor for us to be able to change the risk of childhood obesity is maternal weight status. And so it basically means that if we really want to help pregnant women, we should be focusing not only during pregnancy and maybe the interpregnancy period, but preconceptually. So it's very clear that for intervention studies, based on what we have to date, that we need more studies that combine diet and physical activity, especially targeted to obese women. Some of the, there was a New York Times article that just came out a few weeks ago highlighting one of the studies that was done from a consortium of studies by NIH on obese women, came out of Chicago. And this woman was interviewed, and she basically said that she loved being a participant in this study because the physician was actually providing her tailored information according to her pre-pregnancy weight and giving her more information on how she should be eating. And she basically said, now here I am, a mom taking care of this baby, and I have some tools on how I should be introducing foods to the baby. So we have to think about the fact that while these interventions are there and they might help with weight gain, maybe not mitigate the effects of gestational diabetes and pregnancy-induced hypertension, but in fact, it's an opportune time for us to teach the mom how to take care of herself and how to take care of her future baby by eating well. Clearly, we need to take into consideration stages of change. Is the mom ready to make these changes? If not, how can we get her ready to make these changes? The social cues in our environment to be able to help women sort of stick to those changes in that built environment that will provide them access to healthy foods. And we really have to address these parenting skills and the stressful lives women lead. A lot of the intervention studies you'll see, and some of them that actually are focused in the postpartum period, you get very poor compliance with women coming in for the intervention sessions. And that's the reason why sort of these digital nutrition education opportunities are really attractive, because if you can do some mix of providing them the digital information when they can get it at home or in real time, combined with a face-to-face intervention, that actually might increase the likelihood that we'll make greater impacts in changing women's behavior. And it's very clear that we need frequent interactions. This is not something that we can do lightly. And an interdisciplinary team that's nutritionists, physicians working together, as well as perhaps exercise coaches in order to help women both preconceptually and interconceptually to be able to gain better weight. We definitely need more information on obese women and weight gain and strategies to help. You know, if you tell obese women that they shouldn't gain weight, then you're sort of left with saying, well, what are they doing? Are they like dieting during pregnancy? We don't want them to really diet during pregnancy. We would want them to totally restrict their diets and to become ketosis. So we really need to be careful about giving advice to obese women and what they should be eating. So in summary, evidence in support of a specific dietary pattern during pregnancy being associated with birth outcome is weak, with the exception of preterm birth. However, if you look at those particular foods that kept coming up in the literatures that were associated with positive outcomes, you can actually see a dietary pattern emerging that is very consistent with, in the United States, the dietary guidelines for Americans, as well as some of these dietary guidelines that have been developed across the globe that share those similar characteristics. Maternal obesity is a critical factor in setting the course of pregnancy, and it should be intervened upon prior to pregnancy and in the interpregnancy interval. We definitely need to have physicians trained in how to start that conversation about weight status, to be able to get women to be able to be open to changing their behaviors. And eating healthy and gaining weight within the targeted IOM weight gain ranges can have beneficial effects on the mom and the child in the long term. So thank you very much, and I'll take any questions.